Hello, everybody. Welcome to Behind the Headlines, the Mint Press news interview show that I do twice a week. Thanks for joining us today. Yet another tremendous guest. I'm again excited to call him a friend, but David Swanson is also an author, an anti-war activist, a co-founder of World Beyond War, which we'll get into as well, a global movement to end all wars, which I don't know about you, but I think I'd be a fan of no more war. And his latest book is the Monroe Doctrine, at 200 and what to replace it with. So we'll be getting into all that, the State of the Union, everything else. So please welcome David Swanson.
Hi, Lee. Hello. Great. Hi, Lee. Great to see you.
Great to see you. Thanks for joining me. This exciting day when our brave and bold leader, Joe Biden, will speak to us about how wonderful the United States is doing, how wonderfully we're doing, and if you want to go through all of the proud anti-war peace statements, pro-peace statements Biden will likely be making tonight, please do.
Yeah, I think if you want to stay sober, maybe don't make the drinking words war or Putin or aid or democracy
or China.
It's gonna. Yeah, that's where the gambling comes in. How much will it be hating Russia and how much China? But it's going to be some of each, to be sure, and it's going to be a lot of your duty to stay strong and spend more and ship more weapons and not get war fatigue. But it's, it was 200 years ago in the State of the Union this year that the Monroe Doctrine was created, although it wasn't until December 200 years ago. So maybe they waited until some things had been done and then talked. I don't know if that was the standard back then, but I expect that Biden is going to talk about the incredible things he's accomplished and the promises he's kept, as the New York Times and Washington Post are lauding all the incredible promises he's kept. We recently put out an email at Roots Action trying to remind people of the promises he hasn't kept because it's unbelievable. I mean, if I run through some of them, it sounds, you're going to say, wasn't that Bernie? Don't you mean Bernie? Because
please, we got time. I'd love to hear some of the things he said during his campaign.
So, and the war in Afghanistan, yes, wonderful, terrific. But is it ended? Do drone strikes not count? But also reduce military spending. I mean, this was in the platform, the Democratic Party platform of 2 years ago, and the campaign cut military spending, move the money to useful things. What do? Dramatically increase it year after year after year. End the war on Yemen. Still going. Treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah state. I don't think people could even imagine Joe Biden promising such a thing. But
I was unaware he had said that.
These are his words, not mine. Free kindergarten. Anybody wants kindergarten, preschool? Not kindergarten. We got that. Preschool. Free pre-kindergarten for anybody who wants it. Sounds like a Bernie Sanders promise, and it was, but it was also a Biden promise. Free college, free community college, free college for those with an income under 125,000 or something.
No more student debt, right?
Yeah, get rid of there were variations in what he said and the party said on student debt, but the 10,000 thing ought to have been more. But tax the rich. He's already pre-advertising in the State of the Union. He's going to demand that the Republicans tax the billionaires, tax the oligarchs. That one's my word, not his. But why wait 2 years until the Republicans can more easily block it and then propose to tax the rich when nothing could be more popular? And he promised to tax corporations, tax the wealthy, get rid of the cap on the Social Security tax so the wealthy don't pay such a tiny fraction compared to others. Not a whisper in the past 2 years. Create the so-called public option so that people could get, effectively single payer health coverage for those who want it, that they've, used as a block to the demand for single payer for years and years. What are they doing instead? They're privatizing Medicare. $2 trillion into clean energy. This was a Joe Biden promise. $2 trillion. This is way beyond what they've done. Zero emissions public transit in every city of 100,000 or more people in the United States. Where the hell is that?
I don't think I've ever heard him say the words public transit since he got into office.
Well, I don't even know if Buttigieg says that. How about this one? Private dollars completely out of elections. This is talking to a Congress that won't get rid of insider stock trading despite the demand of over 80% of the public, while bombing people in the name of democracy. So I mean, it's just dozens and dozens of promises that, no, they weren't as good as Bernie's, and Bernie's weren't as good as I might have wanted, but they were just wildly superior to what we've seen, not just done, but even proposed, even talked about, even put up a pretense for during the past 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think we now live in this political landscape where they know they don't mean any of this stuff, and they often will shift who they are between the earlier rounds of the primary and the general. The 1 minute they're trying to beat out like a Bernie Sanders, so they'll pretend to be left wing. Then they get to the general, and all of a sudden they're a centrist, and so they're switching human beings, but during the campaign.
Right, but why are we playing along with it? This is my question. Why do we have these think tanks, Democratic Party affiliated educational institutions claiming that the rich are now massively taxed? I mean, the problem with claiming that is that everybody stops demanding that it be made a reality. If we're going to pretend it's already happening, then what's going to happen when Biden gets up there and stutters his way through some carefully concocted speech, insisting that Republicans are to blame for not taxing the rich? Wait a minute. All of your obedient groups that invert the whole representative process have been claiming for months now that you've already done that. It's very confusing how to be a good party member in these sorts of situations.
And as you well know, one of the most infuriating things is, even in rhetoric, there's barely any daylight between the Republicans and Democrats on war, on endless military spending, on endless bombing. It's tough to find, you'll find like 2 or 3 Republicans who want us to somehow be accountable for the money that's going to Ukraine, et cetera. But for the most part, they're even in the rhetoric, not even in the bullshit they're saying, they all stand up and cheer for war.
Yeah, it's such a pretense on both sides of the teeny little, hair width aisle that divides the two party monstrosities. I mean, I read an article a couple weeks ago now by a DNC guy, what's his name, Cohen, from the Larry Cohen labor union guy, saying, praising all the incredible accomplishments of the Congressional Progressive Caucus over the past couple of years. And one of their big accomplishments was to kill the dirty oil deal of Senator Manchin. And how did they do this? How did they kill the dirty oil deal? Well, before you have a vote on the big military spending bill that must pass, you have a vote on the rule to bring it to a vote. And that's a partisan affair. So when you've got a caucus that's the majority of the Democrats at this point, or it's the biggest caucus in the Democrats, the so-called progressives, and you withhold your votes unless that dirty deal is left out, then you get your way. Now, wait a minute. You're talking about a record-setting military spending bill. You're talking about a caucus that pretends to want to reduce military spending. You're showing exactly how they could use power, rather than introducing a BS bill, as they've now put off for a couple more weeks, to, cut $100 billion out of military spending, which is, nonsense, because it won't pass the House. If it did, it'd have to pass the Senate. If it did, it'd have to pass the White House, right? but you withhold your votes on something until you get something, until you reduce military spending. They didn't even try. They didn't
Yeah.
even pretend they were going to try, but they go around campaigning. The so-called progressive Democrats go around campaigning on reducing military spending. And now, even more so than them, a group of Republicans campaign on that. And they aren't any more serious than the progressive Democrats. It's very different rhetoric. And we're going to now have rallies with speakers, producing both types of very different rhetoric. But it's not serious. It's not making an effort. Look at the promise to end the war on Yemen. That's a Biden promise, a Democratic Party promise.
Mm-hmm.
But a single member of either house can force a debate and a vote tomorrow. Congressman Kucinich used to do this. Under the War Powers Resolution of 73, a single member has the power to force a debate and a vote to make it a priority and make it happen. And not a single one of them wants to. And when Bernie started to some weeks back, Biden called him up and said, back off. And he said, yes, sir. And that's all we've heard of that from that. We haven't seen the action out of Biden that supposedly made that happen. And the only time we've seen the War Powers Resolution used to pass a bill to end a war by both houses and send it to the White House was when Trump had promised to veto it on Yemen. The only times from 1973 till now they could count on a veto, they'll go ahead and pass it, get it vetoed, and blame the veto. It's like the California legislature when there's a Republican governor. They'll pass single payer every time, But why do we have to fall for this stuff?
Yeah, and I mean, what do you attribute this to? I mean, is it just the money? Is it the people funding all their campaigns, or is it the fact that in order to even get to that position, that you're a somewhat powerful congressperson, you've had to sell your soul in the first place to the military-industrial complex? Is it all of those things?
Oh, I think it's clearly all of those and more. It's what gets you acceptance in the corporate media. It's what gets you funding. It's what gets you committee assignments. Ilhan Omar booted off a committee after being the only member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, perhaps in history, certainly in my lifetime, to talk about the evil of U.S. foreign affairs, booted off again with a pretense of resistance from her own party. It's what gets you favors from the White House, operations in your district, jobs in your district. It's what gets you your bills to the floor for votes. It's what prevents the Democratic Party or the Republican Party running a primary challenge against you. It's what prevents your state legislature from redistricting you into somebody else's district. That's where Dennis Kucinich went. It's everything is stacked against you.
Yeah, and then you, like you say, with Kucinich, you occasionally see someone who somewhat pushes back, and the forces that are then encircled, encircling the wagons of various forces to get them out of Congress. People like Cynthia McKinney or Alan Grayson or something. So they don't stay there long, it seems.
Yeah, this is the problem. You have people driven out, but you still have nonetheless incredible popularity for anti-war measures, even though the system is structured against having them happen, and the corporate media depicts them as treasonous and giving away someone else's land to the evil Russian monster and so forth. There's a reason why the Democratic Party platform advertises reduced military spending, and the Democratic Party comes in and increases military spending. And it's because there's a distinction between what people want and what you advertise, and what people will actually insist on getting, and be willing to ignore, and be willing to let you blame on somebody else, and be willing to go along with the pretense that you tried. Uh, but when every year Biden proposes a huge increase to military spending, and then the Congress proposes a huge increase on top of that,
Yeah.
and the Progressive Caucus pretends the first bit never happened and that it's powerless to do anything about the second bit, but blame it on Republicans. And everybody identifies with one party or the other. Not everybody, but millions of people identify with one party or the other and go along. We send out, as I say, an email listing broken promises by Joe Biden, and people don't tell us this is false. People don't tell us you misunderstood. You quoted it wrong. They tell us to shut up. They tell us be quiet. You're helping the Republicans, right? And so it's part of your duty as an adherent to a party to omit negative statements, to highlight positive statements, to go along with myths and lies. That's part of your responsibility, which is justified by a perfectly coherent argument for what you ought to do on one day out of every 2 years, the lesser evil voting argument. But this isn't lesser evil voting. This is lesser evil living, right? This is making it your duty day in, day out. And it's a disaster.
You mentioned the budget a few times, which for our Pentagon is truly astronomical. I mean, the human brain can't even understand it. You count the black budget; it's near over $1 trillion a year. With 21, a few years ago, it was $21 trillion of unaccounted for adjustments over 15 years. They just failed their fifth audit, which they failed every one. And in that fifth audit, they said they can't account for over half their assets. Meaning they don't know where a lot of the stuff is, how it's being used, whether it's being used. This goes for everything from planes and helicopters to buildings. And so it raises the question, is the military accountable to the American people? Especially the finances, which is really what it comes down to in many ways. Are they accountable to the American people at all? Because it seems like Congress doesn't seem to know where any of that money's going or what's happening. They don't, like you said, they don't use their War Powers Act. So
these guys can't find their assets with two hands on a map, right? They don't want to try. Nobody's obliging them to try. Half the time Congress wants to spend more than the Pentagon does and wants less accountability than the Pentagon wants, which wants none at all. It's the only department or agency within the U.S. government that isn't supposed to be accountable at all, even in secret, for what it does. And it's the majority of the money. So, because I'm planning to speak at this rally in a couple weeks with libertarians and progressives united.
I wanted to ask you about that. Yeah.
It's mostly people who haven't sold their soul to one of the two big political parties against war. I've been doing all these shows with libertarians, and now I completely forgot my point, but it was something to do with the spending. Oh yes, on these shows, these libertarian hosts will push me on, we need small government, not big government. Just as on a liberal show, they'll be demanding big government, not small government. But both of these frameworks seem to collaborate in the pretense that the military's free, that the military doesn't cost money, because all I care about is what kind of government. When the majority of your tax dollars, your income tax dollars, more than half of them go to a war machine. Right. When the majority of the discretionary spending, the spending that Congress decides on year after year, goes to a war machine, I don't want to hear people screaming big government, small government at each other. I want to hear people talking about moving the money, and it's popular. It wins every poll every time, despite all the mythology and all the propaganda and all the hatred for Vladimir Putin and love for the Ukrainian people. Every single time people say, move the money to human and environmental needs and out of the military. But it's just not talked about, even in some of these, fringe movements outside of the corporate system. It's not talked about.
Yeah, and another fact, we spend more on our military per year than the bottom 144 countries combined. And I think if you count the black budget, it's like double the bottom 144 countries combined. Um, but talk a little more about this rally, February 19th in Washington, D.C. A bunch of great speakers, and then several speakers I'm not a fan of, but as you said, I think I read it in your email, but maybe it was also a column somewhere. Uh, if we always just virtue signal and decide we can only participate in anti-war events with the people we agree on 100% of everything, then it's a pretty small group.
Very, very small. I don't know if I've ever agreed with everything on with anybody on everything.
Right.
But I think it's a wonderful way you put it, that the U.S. military budget is more than 140 some countries combined. I wouldn't be surprised if it's more, because not everybody, but usually anybody who looks at this looks at it, it's more than the top 9, 10, 11 countries combined. But in fact, there are only 10 or 20 countries that spend anything at all significant on the military, and there are 200 countries in the world, and so it is a more powerful statistic to say, well,
I think Costa Rica has some coconut slingshots they've invested in. So
true, that is a major hurdle here, but it is worth pointing people to the countries like Costa Rica that have put their militaries in museums and said this is a thing of the past, because every other country on earth is closer to that than to the U.S. Nobody is anywhere close to half the U.S. military spending. It's perfectly doable. They're humans. They have the same genes and DNA as we do in Costa Rica. This rally, the website is rageagainstwar.com. The lineup of speakers keeps changing. They keep adding people and people dropping out. And just as I'd like to see someday 1% of the Pentagon budget go into peace initiatives, I'd love to see 1% of the energy that's going into denouncing the speakers at this rally and splitting up coalitions and endorsing and unendorsing and demanding denunciations of each other go to actual peace advocacy. And I would love to see 1% of the corporate media coverage that we're going to get of these divisions and the offensive speakers included go into covering the demand for peace and what it would take to get peace in Ukraine. Absolutely, there are people lined up to speak at this rally that I have important disagreements with. War is not the only important issue, and I don't minimize, people who are being sexist or racist or equally offensive, to my mind, libertarian. Taking resources away from people who are freezing to death and starving to death and have no homes and have no health care, and dumping them into the coffers of billionaires who don't know what to do with it is as offensive as anything, to my mind. All of those things are offensive, but so is nuclear war. And if we have a nuclear war, all of our disagreements die, all of our agreements die, all oppressed and discriminated against groups, insulted and abused by any jackass speaking at an event die. Everybody else dies. Life on Earth is eliminated. And it's incredible the extent to which people still fantasize about a nuclear war in one part of the globe, as if the scientists haven't told us it impacts the entire Earth, and the cloud of dust renders the agriculture impossible, and everybody starves, and the living envy the dead. We're supposed to not know this while, listening to the scientists and following the data and so forth on global warming or other topics, although not doing anything about those either. And so I just I have to prioritize. I mean, if I had my choice of 1,000 big peace rallies to go speak at this month in Washington, D.C., would I pick the one that had the fewest people I disagreed with on anything? I guess I would. Yeah, maybe not, because there's also an advantage to saying, look at this array of diverse opinions.
I long for that moment when you're like, oh, there's so many peace rallies going on. Which one should I go to?
Right, exactly. But I don't have that. I've got, stadiums packed with sports fans, vacation resorts full to the brim. Everybody, gonna take 2 hours to watch Joe Biden with a standing ovation every 8 seconds. But people can't go to a peace rally. Come on, this is a choice people are making, and they're making it because they don't identify with the policy of peace. They identify with obedience to one of the two political parties, both of which want the war, or they believe the propaganda. They believe the good, noble, peaceful thing to do is to dump everything into weapons shipments to Ukraine. And in that situation, am I going to go speak for peace and disarmament with the people willing to do so? Of course.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you on all of that. I want to, since it's all over the news, I want to ask you whether the Chinese weather balloon is a story, or is it, to me, the story is simply America's reaction. The fact that it's being used for immense propaganda, the fact that it's trying to get everyone afraid. But I want to get your thoughts.
Well, I don't have any knowledge, you don't, on whether it's Chinese, whether it's a weather balloon, whether it's a spy balloon, whether it's a super evil, all powerful spy balloon. I have no idea, right? But I do know that the United States has put military bases all around the border of China. I do know that the United States threatens China around Taiwan and little hunks of rock near the Philippines. I do know that the United States flies flights of military planes and sails military ships near China. I know that the United States aims all kinds of missiles at China and makes all kinds of threats toward China. And I know that the United States just announced that it was going to have bases in the Philippines again. Whether that in particular or the whole array is related to the balloon, I have no idea. It certainly is related to Chinese military spending. We were talking about earlier that Chinese military spending is way down here. And every time U.S. military spending goes up, so does Chinese military spending, even though it's a tiny fraction. Then that's used as the justification for more U.S. military spending. So the hypocrisy is just incredible. If somebody had, surrounded your house with military installations and you sent a balloon out the window, who would have more justification for getting mad, you or them? It just seems incredible to me that the United. I mean, it's like a new Sputnik, right? I thought they should call it
right. It feels very similar to the freak out around Sputnik, although I wasn't alive then, but I've heard about it.
I was on the Sputnik Russian media network the other day and suggested that we name the balloon the Sputternik in honor of Joe Biden's beloved speech patterns. But I think it's a freaking out. And why would you not go talk when you have one more item to talk to the Chinese about? Why would you now cancel the talks? It doesn't make any sense unless the whole goal is to heighten the tension. This is what the weapons dealers want and live off of, is heightening the tension. But what good does it do for the rest of us?
And then there's the fact that China has satellites, as do we. They can see pretty much everything. So the idea that they needed to send a weather balloon from Alaska to Montana to North Carolina to see some farmers picking their wedgies out of their ass cracks, it seems like it's not really a surveillance balloon. But besides that, I wanted to point out, because you mentioned the bases, I have a chart here that someone has put together. And it shows, it's got little pink pinpricks for all the U.S. bases surrounding China, surrounding Iran, surrounding Russia. And Russia has, on my episode of Most Censored News this week, I'll be talking about how Russia has 20 bases. This is not to say Russia isn't involved militaristically in some certain events right now, but they have 20 bases outside of Russia, mainly in the former Soviet bloc. And then China has one base outside of China in Djibouti. And, you compare that to the 800 to 900 the U.S. has, and it's kind of insane.
It's absolutely insane. We've actually made a tool at worldbeyondwar.org where you can spin a globe around, zoom in on one of the little dots, click on it, and it'll zoom in and tell you all about the base and show you images of the base. And there's nearly 900 U.S. bases on there, and we're working on adding, or we may do it on a second globe on the same page, all of the foreign military bases of all the other countries in the world put together. And it's going to look like pretty much an empty globe in comparison to the one with all the US bases.
Right.
But I go on Russian TV and say, the fact that Russia can commit so much mass murder and destruction and mayhem with 8% the military budget of the United States tells you something about the corruption of the U.S. military. And they let me get away with that and invite me back on, even though I'm
very different than your average U.S. mainstream media.
Yes, indeed.
Very true. Well, let's move over to Ukraine and discuss that for a few moments. I think because I've spoken to you, I think since it started, since the Russian invasion started, and I believe your view is pretty similar to mine in that, you're opposed to the Russian invasion. I'm opposed to the Russian invasion. War is disgusting and horrific. And at the same time, I also think people should understand the history of NATO, understand the 2014 coup in Ukraine and things like that. And they should understand kind of the entirety of the reality. But if in order to be fully anti-war, everyone says, oh, you're just defending Putin or Russia or something.
Yeah, it's incredible. I can say we need negotiations and a ceasefire and a peaceful settlement with a stable, peaceful result going forward. And if I'm in the United States, I'm paid by Putin. I'm in the pay of the Russians. But if I say that in Moscow, suddenly I'm getting funded by the CIA, right? I mean, it's magic. And of course, either way, I can show completely empty pockets. So it's a real magic trick. But this is what we need, right? Because both sides are lying. Russia is claiming imminent victory. It's not about to happen. The West is claiming imminent victory. Russia will be completely defeated, total surrender. Not about to happen. What you're going to see if there's not an effort to end the war, not to win the war, whatever that means, but to end the war, you're going to see ongoing deaths by the hundreds of thousands, destruction, increased hostilities, increased difficulty ever getting to a stable, peaceful settlement, and the ever heightened risk of nuclear apocalypse. If not nuclear apocalypse, which you won't be seeing because you won't be here. This is the problem. And so, we're told that the Republicans want to give Ukrainian land away to Russia, and the Democrats want to fight to the last Ukrainian. But, we have to have peace or war. Nonviolence or non-existence, as Dr. King said. And the way that you get to nonviolence is through a negotiated settlement. And that means a compromise. That means Russia giving up some things it wants and Ukraine giving up some things it wants. And the way you get to a stable resolution, other than building better relations and having a truth and reconciliation process, is by letting people decide. And of course, no one outraged by the greatest evil of the past decades, with, Iraq and Afghanistan and other things somehow obliterated from all memory, being the annexation of Crimea. Not a single person has ever wanted the people of Crimea to vote again, because they know damn well that the people of Crimea would have voted to join Russia any year of the past decades, and would.
Well, I think it's something like 80 or 90% of them consider themselves Russian.
Right. And so this is so you have to get to a peaceful enough situation observed by all the right observers and agreed to by all parties and have another vote. And Crimea, of course, will vote to be part of Russia. But you have to do the same thing in the Donbass. And of course, this was done. And there was the Minsk II agreements. And there was an understanding that they would have autonomy and there would be peace and de escalation. And you have Western leaders like former leader of Germany, Angela Merkel, admitting that this was nonsense. This was playing the Russians like they were Native Americans. You were promising they'd have their land until as
Yeah,
long as the grass grew, and it was all
she admitted that it was basically a stall tactic to further firm up, and arm Ukraine.
exactly right. So now to compound all the difficulties, you have the difficulty getting anyone to believe you should you be willing to do any sort of negotiations. And this means that the United States and NATO have to take actual verifiable steps to demilitarize in Eastern Europe, have to start taking their missiles back out of Poland and Romania, stop adding new countries into NATO and so forth, have to actually do empirically verifiable things because their words are useless. So this adds to the difficulty, but it's not that difficult, right? When Donald Trump says I'd do it in 24 hours, doesn't mean we can believe he would. Doesn't mean we can be sure he wouldn't screw up even something that easy. But it does mean it is doable. It is conceivable. Even that idiot could possibly do it. It's a question of wanting to try.
Well, yeah. Trump actually, he accidentally, through his own, ego and whatever reasons he had, showed us what happens when a president tries to create a peace that the military-industrial complex and the U.S., most of the U.S. ruling class doesn't want, such as with North Korea. It is ultimately stopped. The peace deal, and again, I have gone after Trump more than anyone, but there were a few moments he said he was going to take troops out of Afghanistan. He said he was going to take troops out of Syria. Each time it was carefully stopped before he could even come close to achieving those things.
Absolutely. But he could have tried more,
Yeah.
and he could have refrained from threatening to nuke North Korea. Not a helpful bit of the negotiations.
He also could have refrained from dropping 40,000 bombs a year. But
he could have refrained from sending weapons to Ukraine, as in fact President Obama did. The damn Putin-loving Russian socialist communist former president of the United States.
And for holding up the bombs to Ukraine, I mean the missiles to Ukraine, Trump was impeached.
He was impeached. Yes, you can't be impeached unless you've done something vaguely anti-war. I mean, this is what you have to be impeached for. I think you may have talked to me when I had a list of like my top 75 reasons to impeach Donald Trump, and slowing down weapons shipments to Ukraine wasn't on there. That just wasn't in that mix and shouldn't have been.
Right.
We're coming up on 20 years now since George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Colin Powell, and gang got away with just openly lying. Colin Powell taking just certifiable BS denounced by his own staff at the State Department and feeding it to the world.
That was 20 years ago this week. Colin Powell did that.
Yeah, and no accountability. To this day, no investigations with any consequences, no exposure, no truth and reconciliation, no impeachment, no prosecutions. There was a period when you could block wars, when you could stop a war on Iran or Syria by saying it's going to be another Iraq. There was a period when you couldn't get a John Kerry or a Hillary Clinton or a Joe Biden nominated for president. But that's faded, and the lesson's been learned. The military wasn't scaled back. The lies were only momentarily a little glitch, and the machine rolls on.
So let me ask you about World Beyond War, your project, your movement, and your website. what would I don't know if this is the type of thing you can relay in a few minutes time, but what are the steps to get to a world beyond war?
Well, there are quite a few, and it's not necessarily something that can be done in a day.
Yeah.
But steps is a key word, right? I said every time US military spending goes up, so does Chinese. The reverse almost certainly would be the case. If US military spending went down, so would Chinese. It's
Hmm.
it's very easy to test, and it has the support of overwhelmingly of the US public. And to go just back before Colin Powell opened his big mouth at the UN, you'd have to cut about 45% of current US military spending. To go back to the glorious, righteous day of 1950, you'd have to cut, I think, about 85% of current US military spending. It's completely possible to survive while moving in a peaceful direction rather than in a warmongering direction. The problem is people don't believe it. People, watch war movies, infotainment, and so-called history are saturated with thousands and thousands of hours of the stuff, and they don't believe it. They don't believe that there isn't going to be another World War II, possibly next month, and you try to get them to name a war they feel justified arguing for the necessity of during the past 75, 80 years, and they can't do it, but they'll scream World War II at you. Uh, and you try to tell them it's a different world. The world is radically different from the 1940s, and they don't care. And so you have to teach them about nonviolence. If you're at worldbeyondwar.org and you type in /list, worldbeyondwar.org/list, you get a list of dozens and dozens of times through the history of the world when people have been told it's war or nothing, an invasion, a coup, a brutal dictatorship,
Yeah.
and they've used nonviolence instead, and it's more successful. I mean, nonviolence denial is as dangerous as climate denial, and we want to look at the facts, look at the facts. Nonviolent action works better. But nobody knows this. It's so radically out of whack with everything they think they know, that it's very hard to get people to really internalize it. I mean, I can talk to people about World War II for half an hour and radically shift their views on World War II, but you can even watch the latest Ken Burns film. I never thought I'd say that. You can even watch the latest video series from Rachel Maddow about fascism in the US. I never thought I'd say that, but for people to understand that unarmed resistance is more powerful than armed, it takes more than a few minutes, takes more than an hour lecture. But it seems to be the truth.
Yeah, I just noticed on your site, one of the mottos you have here is Russia out of Ukraine, NATO out of existence. Talk a little about NATO. I think most of our viewers understand that NATO is not a peacekeeping organization, but a lot of Americans still believe that. They still believe that, if it's got a NATO stamp of approval, that means it's a good war. It's a peaceful war. It's it's going to lead to nice, peaceful happiness. Unlike the invasion of Iraq, but NATO is a war creator.
If you go back to worldbeyondwar.org and you type in /constitutions, you find a list of the world's constitutions and treaties and laws that ban war. There are numerous treaties to which the United States is party that ban war. It's a crime. But if you get a gang together to commit a crime, it's not a crime anymore. Everybody knows this. If you're going to go rob 7-Eleven, but you get 5 buddies with a couple cars and a bunch of guns, it's not a crime anymore because it's a bunch of you doing it together, right? This is the idea with NATO. With NATO, Congress doesn't have to look into particular atrocities because it's not their responsibility. It's NATO. With NATO, it's not a rogue state abusing the world. It's the international community, which if you look up the definition of international community, it says right there, U.S. weapons customers. That's the international community. And it doesn't matter that most of the world's population and most of the world's nations aren't in it. it's legal now. This is the problem with NATO. It's an institution that depends on war. Without war, it doesn't have a reason to exist. Without danger, it doesn't have a reason to exist. NATO was dreaming of Russia doing something like invading Ukraine. The Rand Corporation was writing papers about the need for Russia to do something like invading Ukraine. People tell me Russia had no choice because of NATO but to invade Ukraine. And I say, but didn't they know, as we all knew, that Russia invading Ukraine would be a bigger boost to NATO than anything NATO could possibly ever do on its own? They say, well, yes. Well, but then how is it justified as opposition to NATO when it is the single biggest gift to NATO in decades? This is what NATO lives for. NATO's trying to figure out a way to get Latin American countries and Asian countries into it, align with other military alliances like AUKUS, and turn China into an enemy. And the president of Ukraine, this saintly figure, this Frankenstein monster gone out of control, is trying to get NATO into the war, is trying to get NATO attacked, is trying to claim NATO has been attacked with a missile that he knew where it came from, and he said it came from somewhere else.
For those who remember that, they claimed that a missile hit Poland that was a Russian missile, but it actually came from Ukraine. But they knew instantly, and Scott Ritter told me that the U.S., the way we track missiles, we knew instantly that it did not come from Russia, and yet we let that propaganda run wild that Russia had bombed Poland.
Well, the U.S. was slow to speak, but finally,
eventually, after a few hours,
said no. It came from Ukraine. Ukraine never did. The president of Ukraine went on saying, despite all the evidence and his backers and his sugar daddy in Washington saying otherwise, just went on saying it's Russian. This guy wants World War III because this is what it would be. NATO is the madness that everyone says started World War I. When you line up your countries to be obliged to join in some other country's wars. This is what NATO is. When England and France start fighting over some little island in the English Channel, I always worry that every NATO member is going to be obliged to attack both of them at once, because this is what the NATO Charter is. But if you look at the NATO Charter, if you look at the treaty that created NATO, it is one of these dozens of treaties that bans war because it starts out with saying it agrees with the UN Charter banning war, with some little loopholes that everyone pretends all these wars fall into, but they don't.
Yeah. I want to not run out of time to talk about your new book, The Monroe Doctrine at 200 and What to Replace It With. Of course, we haven't, one area of the world we haven't gotten into yet is Latin America. So talk a little about your new book.
Well, again, 200 years ago this year, 1823, was a big year, a lot going on. The president of the United States, James Monroe, gave a speech in which he uttered certain words that were pretty quickly treated as important, but were later labeled the Monroe Doctrine, and eventually acquired the sainted status of the Declaration of Independence or the Bible or the Constitution. I mean, through the 19th century and into the 20th, it was this important in U.S. culture, and its use hasn't diminished in the slightest. Just the popularity of using the phrase has, although Trump loved it, Biden doesn't. The behavior doesn't differ as much as the rhetoric. But this was essentially the declaration that the whole hemisphere of the Americas, Northern, Central, Caribbean, South America, was a U.S. playground, and European nations needed to stay out. And this was a frequent justification for U.S. expansion westward, through the middle of North America, which people forget happened at all, much less associate with the Monroe Doctrine, which they think is just about south of the border. But the border wasn't there. These people wanted the Caribbean, Central America, South America, Canada. They only got part of what they wanted, but they keep on pushing. And of course, in 1823 as well, James Monroe's lifelong buddy, the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall, put the doctrine of discovery into U.S. law, which is the centuries-old Catholic doctrine that says essentially any European nation or the United States that sees any territory not already claimed by a European nation or the United States can go ahead and claim it because those people don't count. And these doctrines together, created this sort of disaster. They're doing polls now, right? Are we at 30% or 40% of people in the United States who think Ukraine is in the U.S. national interest? Well, where did this nonsense come from? It came from the Monroe Doctrine, this language of U.S. rights and interests, so that you could go to war over something that wasn't the United States itself, but was some distant interest. And the whole mythology of how wars can get started and how they're not imperialistic grew out of the Monroe Doctrine. So these are people who believed that they were defending the Western Hemisphere from European dictatorships and monarchies, and therefore they were being anti-imperialistic. And if they were trying to get Cuba or Texas or anybody else into the United States, that wasn't imperialistic at all, because anybody would want to be part of the United States. And so they really sold imperialism as anti-imperialism, and did away with the notion of congressional war powers. We talked about how Congress tried to put that into law in 1973 and hasn't really used it since. But Monroe said, we're going to have wars over any European nation messing around in this whole hemisphere. So this is a whole list of wars. This is an authorization for the use of military force. And it's a red line. It's the precedent for all the damn red lines of, war in Syria if chemical weapons are used, war in Ukraine if NATO is attacked, and so on. It's a foundational document of a new sort of empire, of an old sort of empire and a new sort of empire. It's evolved through the centuries, but it's alive and well. It's alive and kicking. It's the coups. It's the U.S. corporations owning and making the laws in whole areas of Central American countries today. It's the weapons and the training of the armies in Latin America. It's Elon Musk saying we'll coup whoever we want. Screw you. This is it.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize that the level that this still goes on, where the U.S. is still controlling what goes on in these countries. It was just a few weeks ago, we helped, if we weren't the main player, but we at least helped coup 2 countries in 2 days. One was Peru, where we clearly were some sort of advisor on the lawfare coup done against Castillo. And then in Argentina, there was a lawfare coup to stop the vice president from being able to ever run for president, which she was planning to do. And she is a leftist, and she likely would have won very easily. And they succeeded in bringing false charges against her to stop her from being able to be president of Argentina. And so, these are the things the U.S. is involved in. It just has switched to more sanctions and lawfare than taking people out with bullets.
I think that's exactly right. But I think what's encouraging in recent years is the number of failed coups and the number of coups not really attempted, despite better than average governments and presidents being elected. And, in some cases, like Colombia, a left-leaning president elected for the first time ever, and no coup. And I think it's, and to a laughable extent, right, where the U.S. treats this non-government of this clown named Juan Guaido as the proper government of Venezuela, despite it never having been the government of Venezuela.
Right.
It's become laughable, but in part, it's not a shift to benevolence by the United States. Maybe in part it is, but in part, it's the United States already having the corporate trade agreements in place, the ability of corporations to sue their way to absolute power in Latin America. It's having the elites trained and educated and indoctrinated. It's all the systems of control that they've already got, so that they don't absolutely need the president of every country anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair point. I'm trying to see what I haven't asked you about. I mean, these sanctions are so aggressive on some of these countries, which maybe you can talk for a moment about that. Sanctions essentially are economic war, and in many cases, depending on the type of war, we can kill more with sanctions than we kill with bombing. In Afghanistan, not every year of our war on Afghanistan, but at least the last couple, we're killing more now in Afghanistan with sanctions than we killed 2 years ago with drone bombs. In Syria, 90% of the people there are under the poverty level, and of course it's not just can't get food, it's can't get gas, can't get medical supplies. Some countries are faring better than others, Cuba and Iran, but sanctions kill.
Absolutely. And when it's collective punishment, when it's not even a pretense of targeted individuals with sanctions, which is of dubious nature in terms of the targeting and dubious legality itself, but when you're targeting a whole population for punishment, it's illegal under the Geneva Conventions. It's criminal, it's immoral, and it can be very, very deadly, more deadly than some wars. And when you're looking at the resources dumped into the wars that could be used for positive good, well, there you're killing lots more people than the wars, until the wars go nuclear. And when you're stealing money from places like Afghanistan and Venezuela, it's not just refusing to trade with countries, and it's not just blockading other countries from trading, imposing punishments on other countries that trade with Cuba, but it's stealing their money as part of coups or part of wars. So we look at the Philippines, where actually a decent op-ed in the New York Times today, and it's something else I never thought I'd say, and yet it pushes this legislation that would stop the U.S. reoccupation of the Philippines under the guise of withholding assistance and aid until the Philippines behave better, and imposing sanctions, targeted sanctions on the evildoers in the Philippines. I mean, this is how they have to frame it. They can't say, we're going to stop occupying the world. We're not going to put military forces in a country that had a massive movement to kick them out, and where the people don't want them any more than they want the Chinese. They have to say, the world wants U.S. troops and ships and planes, but we're not going to let the Philippines have them unless the Philippines do better, and we're going to punish the Philippines. This is not how they don't work. This is the other dirty little secret about the sanctions. They don't work on their own terms. They haven't reformed any governments. They've just punished people. And at some point, again, if we're going to follow the facts and let the science lead us and so forth, why do something evil and causing such suffering when for decades it's failed to ever do what it's advertised as doing, just because it's macho and retributive, and this isn't a good excuse.
Yeah, it's because what they advertise the goals as being are not the real goals. The real goals are to create failed societies, to just harm people into oblivion, to make sure the country can't be some sort of strong competitor to U.S. hegemony. as you well know. But thank you so much, David, for speaking with me. I hope everybody checks out your new book, and the website is worldbeyondwar.org, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And Lee, I assume you're with me on this. Watch UVA beat NC State. Do not watch Joe Biden run his mouth. I mean, this is not a tough choice, people.
Yeah, I'm always impressed with people who are able to sit through the whole State of the Union. But I guess if you're a glutton for punishment and you like to see the number of lies being perpetrated, then maybe that's understandable. But thanks again, David, and I hope to speak to you soon. Keep doing all your amazing work.
You too. Thanks, Lee.
See you soon.
Okay.
All right, that is David Swanson. Thank you guys so much for joining me here. I hope you'll check out worldbeyondwar.org. It sounds like it has a great list of resources there as well. Things like where all the U.S. military bases are and stuff like that. So important site to keep on your list of bookmarks. So as some of you may know, we are completely independently funded. These shows would not exist without you supporting us. So I hope you find value in them, and I hope you're willing to throw in a couple of dollars, the cost of a coffee, to make sure this show and Most Censored News continue. You can do that by going to patreon.com/behindtheheadlines. You can also do it by hitting I believe it says join on YouTube next to where you'd hit subscribe. Obviously, please hit subscribe. Please hit the notify bell icon. So maybe YouTube will sometimes tell you when we have a video coming out. But I do 2 of these interviews a week. I also put out a Most Censored News episode a week. So you get at minimum 3 episodes from Behind the Headlines a week. And this is a Mint Press project. So I hope you also check out Mint Press News. And I will see you, let's see, in a couple of days. I always forget. It's amazing. Even though it's 2 days away, I always forget who I'm talking to. Oh, Andy Lee Roth, I believe, the co-director or the director of Project Censored, the co-founder of Project Censored. And he'll be talking about their new book on all the most censored topics of the year. But all right, keep fighting, folks. I'll see you Thursday.